What you're about to hear is part 4 of a multi-part series on the First World War. If you like your stories to have some sort of cohesive, linear narrative flow, although I'm not promising that, I probably couldn't deliver on that. But if that's what you like, we're probably better off suggesting you go check out episode number 1 and work your way to here. If you don't care about that kind of stuff at all, or you just don't trust me to deliver a cohesive, linear narrative flow, and I wouldn't blame you, well, then by all means start here at part 4 and check out this series that we're calling Blueprint for Armageddon.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
It's history.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The events. The figures.
Not quite to the noise, master.
Let the word go forth from this time and place.
I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The drama.
Gate 6 to Manhattan, urgent. Marine 6. Tower 2 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their
The
president's a
deep
crook.
questions.
Well, I'm not a crook.
If we dig deep in our history and our doctrine, and remember that we are not descended from fearful men.
Command the field com.
It's hardcore history.
How do you market war? How do you sell combat to the people who are actually going to have to engage in it? It's not a hypothetical question, by the way. Any military that requires volunteers to decide they want to join the service has to think about how you actually sell the idea to the people who, have to take part in it. An idea that carries with it the potential for some very nasty outcomes in the very worst of circumstances, doesn't it? It's a difficult job, perhaps, to market combat. It's easier to do in peacetime, though, right? If you have to sell suntan oil to people in Alaska, you might be able to pull that off in the summer. In December, it's a really tough sell. Before the First World War breaks out, if you're trying to market recruitment into the British Army, you can sell the same sort of talking points, the same sort of angles that have worked for governments and monarchies and tribes going back to the beginning of civilization. The military's long had certain selling points. I think we're all familiar with them. You could add regular pay thrown into that as well. The heroism, the adventure, the status. There's a lot of things. Some people just like to fight. You never know. The problem is that that's a pre-1914, talking point when it comes to what happens when the First World War breaks out and how that just totally messes with your marketing strategy unless you're marketing hell as a travel destination. You can't, no matter how much press censorship you have, and the British had plenty in the First World War, just like everyone else, you can't mask those kind of casualty numbers. Now, you can mask the reality, the sort of stuff that some of these newspaper reporters who were censored during the war, after the war, they would write books telling you the real story, what really happened, because you couldn't have imagined it, and it was all censored by the press. Even with the censorship, you can't hide the death and destruction and dismemberment, and you see the people returning to your hometown with the horrible wounds, and you hear some of the rumors and stories. You know it's not going to be fun. All of a sudden, the marketing in Great Britain's recruitment operation have to play hardball. No more just throwing out carrots. They're going to use some sticks, too. In the U.S., we have a 21st century volunteer army ourselves, and the U.S. uses just carrots to encourage people to join up. We'll pay you more. We'll pay you for college. You'll make something of your life. There's all these different things that they use to motivate people, but there's not very many sticks in the U.S. system. Once the first couple of weeks of the First World War happen, and everybody together finds out how enormous this is going to be in an absolutely stunning group wake-up call where the light goes on over everyone's head and they're going, oh my gosh, we don't have enough resources. And oh my gosh, we don't have enough money for a war like this. And oh my gosh, we don't have enough people. And even some of these larger states where you think to yourself, oh, people shouldn't be a problem. Look at how many people are coming out every generation. Remember, manpower, in the old air quotes, means manpower across the board, not just the people fighting on the front line, but the people that can still be miners to extract the material you need to carry on the war, or people working in arms manufacturing plants so that they can build the bombs you need to fight the war. In other words, if you take too much to throw on the fighting line, you won't have enough people back home making the stuff that the people on the fighting line need to win. Manpower becomes a very big deal. All these other countries in the war, Germany, France, Russia, no problem. They've spent decades working out a conscription operation where they draft people. You come of age, you do a couple of years in the service, and then you become parts of the reserves, and then you become parts of the other reserve, heavier and older reserve, and, after a while, they've got a whole revolving, self-perpetuating system in place, whereas every generation comes up, they're cranking out new soldiers, except for Great Britain. They're the last volunteer service involved in this conflict. When it breaks out, it puts unique pressures on them. The first thing they do is simply ask people to join up. And remember, in 1914, you didn't quite know what you were in for. You could still sell the old selling points. The uniforms are wonderful. And the women, you'll look dashing. And it'd just be, war, adventure, kill the Boche, all the good methods. The king needs you, king and country, all the things that have always worked, and still work, by the way, in a lot of cases, especially in peacetime, worked, and more folks in Britain and Scotland and Canada and Australia and all these places signed up than they even could handle. They were looking for a couple 100,000, got a lot more than that. But that's before the casualties start happening. A lot of patriotic Britons sign up, but you don't know how many patriotic Britons you're going to need, and not just in one big lump, but every month to replace the troops you lose. In late 1915, the British just lose at Gallipoli, and they walk away after a couple of months with 250,000 casualties. You don't just replace those by playing nice and easy and saying, fight the king and country. You're using more hardball methods. And one of the ones that I've always thought was just indicative of something that if you imagined it in modern times, it boggles the mind. Using a strategy like this today, but it's absolute genius. It shows exactly the most vulnerable point in a young man's, psyche. The place where if you're a marketer, you're looking for what motivates people, how you can touch these elements of influence. And the Order of the Feather, the White Feather movement, is absolutely brilliant in that regard. It's almost devious. Try to imagine our government doing something like this today with modern 21st century technology. It's interesting to think about. But basically, when August, early September 1914 rolls around, there's an admiral in the British Admiralty who's working like everyone else to think about how can we encourage more people to sign up for this horrible war, and comes up with, an attack on a motivation, a marketing strategy. He's going to enlist patriotic young British women to walk the streets of all these towns in Britain, their hometowns, where there are people they know, and if they see men not in uniform who look like they could be or should be, they're going to go up, surround this person, and start saying the most horrible thing. You're a coward, and all these terrible things to them. Pretty women in public dressing you down if you're 18 years old. That's a pretty good marketing, chink in someone's armor to exploit. Not just that, you're probably, and usually were, on the street of your hometown, where the passers-by know you or your family. This is a profoundly embarrassing moment, for everyone around you, everyone connected with you. God forbid if you have a girlfriend, she's going to think this looks pretty bad for her too. The effect was huge. And then before this little group of women were done with you, they would put a white feather signifying cowardice on your lapel or somewhere very visible, on you. This was not an unusual occurrence. There are accounts from people that say they were afraid to go outside the house sometimes because these patriotic and zealous women who were really just trying to help. That's the funny part. This is the society motivating patriotism, all these things, right? It's all the right virtues. But I've got an account from a 16-year-old boy who had to go through this. And then he signed up for the service because he was so deathly embarrassed and afraid and ashamed. And the service person laughed him out of the room, but then said he looked so downtrodden, he exaggerated his height, exaggerated his age, exaggerated his weight, and he was in. At 16, under 110 pounds, on the Western Front. It's absolutely deviously played. I try to imagine us using it today. You know, these ideas could backfire, though, these creative marketing recruitment ideas. For example, the government felt the need to put out symbols that people could wear who had already done their service overseas and had been wounded and honorably discharged, or who worked for some really important armaments or war-related industry and couldn't be spared, because apparently enough of those people were being mistakenly given the Order of the White Feather treatment to make that an important thing for the government to do. There were other creative marketing plans, not sticks, but carrots, and one of them, another brilliant one when you think about it on the surface, involved the British government explaining to recruits that if you sign up with your pals, your buddies, you could all serve together. And so people joined up from the same street, or the same pub, or the same community, or the same fraternity, or the same profession, and they all served together, and they had wonderful names. These are like military unit names that they're still known by. I mean, there were the Liverpool Pals, or the Grimsby Chums, and these friends all went to the service. You figure if you gotta serve, you might as well do it with your friends, but then you get to watch your friends die. It's the part we didn't really consider when we signed up, and it sounded kind of fun. Not just that, when these units would get decimated in some of these terrible encounters, for example, you could be walking down a road with your pals in the open and all of a sudden get caught by artillery fire, suffer 80% casualties, and then, instead of the losses and the suffering and the grief being spread out, sort of diluted across the width and breadth of the entire British Isles, or British Empire for that matter, some local community, or some fraternity, or some profession just gets pounded. And there are villages and towns in Britain now that had these terrible days just happen to the whole community. And pretty much everybody suffers a major loss one way or the other. That's the downside of that clever marketing plan. By 1916, there's nothing clever enough to get enough people. The losses are so high that the British finally do what the British really don't do, and they started conscripting their people. It's hard to blame the British, too, for starting the same sort of draft that the continental great powers use. All you have to do, as we said, the casualties are so high. Look at them. By the end of 1915, the British have suffered 500,000 casualties. 200,000 of those are dead, by the way. For a traditionally naval power who has traditionally a rather small army by continental standards, those are huge numbers. Now, you want to see what continental standards look like? Look at the British ally, the French, who've had a huge army in the meat grinder since the first minute of this whole affair, and by the end of 1915, their casualties are over 2 million. More than 700,000 of those are dead. And all these great powers are looking at their principal enemies and trying to figure out how close they are to the throwing in the towel moment. The Germans are looking at the French and all the casualties they've suffered, and they're looking and they're thinking, they must be close to the end of their rope. The Germans have suffered more casualties by the end of 1915 than the French, but they're fighting on more fronts, right? They're fighting the French and the British in the West. There's gigantic Russian forces in the East, and they're involved in the Balkans a lot in 1915. Their casualties by the end of 1915 are over 2.5 million. About 750,000 of those are dead. Hard to know. The Germans list 250,000 missing. In this war, people got blown to bits. They got covered up by, giant mountains of earth that shells had blown up in the air, falling back on the ground. A lot of missing people, probably between 750 and 800,000 dead for the Germans at this point in the war. The Russians have suffered titanic losses from minute one. They lost a huge battle in 1915 called Gorlice Tarnov, and that battle all by itself, they lost 150,000 dead, almost 700,000 wounded, and basically 1 million prisoners. Those are titanic losses. Maybe it's easier to understand their monthly burn rate. By October 1915, the Russians are losing 235,000 men a month. How sustainable is that? Again, you got to be looking at the Russians thinking, They're almost done, and the German high command kind of is. Now, the Germans can't be too happy, though, because their main ally, the Austro-Hungarians, are suffering casualties that are every bit as momentous as the Russians, but they don't have the manpower to back that up. I mean, in one 4-month period in 1915, one 4-month period, the Austrians suffer 750,000 casualties. Boom. That's in addition to the already astounding casualties they took in the few months right after the war started. The Germans several times will have to prop up the Austrians just to keep them able to continue in the conflict. And the Austrians are a pain in the rear to their German allies a lot of the time. I mean, for Erich von Falkenhayn, the German commander in charge in January 1916, he can't stand them. They're always getting into some sort of disaster that they then go to Falkenhayn and ask for help getting out of. And to make matters worse, it's usually a disaster that von Falkenhayn warned them about in advance. Don't do that. It'll be a disaster. And then they do it against his wishes and then come and ask to be bailed out multiple times. They can always play their trump card, though, against von Falkenhayn. Legitimately considering huge casualties they've suffered, they can kind of go there and say, well, listen, I mean, if you don't help us, we're not that far from dropping out of the war. I don't know. I can't guarantee we'll be here. And, you have to help them. It's a strategic disaster if the Austro-Hungarians drop out of the war, right? But von Falkenhayn doesn't want to pay any attention to any of these other fronts. He doesn't want to worry about the Russians. There are German generals and whatnot that keep saying, we need to focus on the Russians. That's how we win the war. Falkenhayn doesn't want to hear about that. Doesn't want to focus in the Balkans, although in 1915 they destroyed Serbia. Get that out of the way. Falkenhayn doesn't want to hear about the Middle East and the Turks. He doesn't want to talk about Austria and her problems. Doesn't want to know what Italy's doing. He wants to focus on this maybe war-winning or war-losing Gordian knot that is the puzzle that must be solved if you are a general tasked with winning this war. It's the Western Front. How do you deal with that? And it's an unprecedented problem. You know, there's a famous German saying that may or may not have happened, but it's infused this whole period where one German general is supposed to have commented about how amazingly the British troops fought, and he said they're lions. And the sub-commander with him is supposed to have said something to the effect of, yes, lucky for us they're led by donkeys. 1915's Western Front battles are where the donkeys first get labeled with that sort of reputation. At the same time, when you realize that they have no metrics for what they're doing in 1915, this has never been done before. Nobody's ever had this kind of firepower. Nobody's ever put these kind of defenses up. I mean, we're playing with all sorts of new military toys, and they've never been tested in a situation like this. How much slack do you cut the generals and give them what is sometimes called by historians, in this case, a learning curve? When you're playing with people's lives, how slowly are you allowed to figure things out? We didn't go into any of the 1915 battles. Winston Churchill is just one of many people who objects to the whole idea of calling those battles in the 1915 year, or 1916 year, or 1917 year battles. He says it's a disservice to what the name means. He said there were battles in 1914 at the start of the war, and there were battles in 1918 at the end of the war, but that stuff in the middle was a siege. That's quote. These sanguinary, prodigious struggles, extending over many months, are often loosely described as battles, judging by the number of men who took their turn in the fighting at different times, by the immense quantities of guns and shells employed, and by the hideous casualty totals. They certainly rank, taken as a whole, among the largest events in military history. But we must not be misled by terminology. If to call them battles was merely a method of presenting a general view of an otherwise confusing picture, it might well pass unchallenged. But an attempt has been made by military commanders and by a whole school of writers to represent these prolonged operations as events comparable to the decisive battles of the past, only larger and more important. To yield to this specious argument is to be drawn into a wholly wrong impression, both of military science and of what actually took place in the Great War. End quote. These battles on the Western Front, for a full 3 years in the conflict, look pretty much like this, as described by historian Holger Herwig. quote. The fighting on the Western Front had taken on a deadly regularity. Attackers stormed enemy trenches in waves, only to be mowed down by hostile machine gun fire and artillery as they tried to cut the wire entanglements that protected the earthworks. And there's a repetitiveness to the fighting on the Western Front. It's a repetitiveness that actually is associated with World War I and the Western Front specifically. It's part of the tragedy. It adds to the pain. Because after all, if you've seen the same event over and over and over again, doesn't it become a different kind of tragic? If you watch the first wave of those young soldiers leave the safety of their trench, go over the top at the whistle of their officer, get mowed down by machine gun fire before they've even gone 10 feet, that's tragic. It's another level of tragedy when the next wave gets up right behind them to follow in their footsteps, having already seen what happened to them. That's what we wanted to capture in our discussions of the Western Front, because it became an issue early on, how we were going to deal with all these battles that were roughly the same, equally tragic, and for the soldiers on the ground, eerily similar. When trying to figure out what we wanted to highlight, a Shakespeare quote kept popping in my head. It was his line that all the world's a stage and all the people merely players. And I thought to myself, well, that's what we have here. We have one of the most extreme stages in human history. We've created, with these Western Front battles in 1915, 1916, 1917, a hell-like environment. And then we force millions of people to act in it. It's some of the most extreme situations people have been put into ever in history. And watching how they endure is sometimes soul-crushing, but at other times, it's absolutely life-enhancing. Sometimes you can benefit quite a bit from the suffering of other people. As we sat down when we started this series and tried to figure out a creative approach to dealing with all these battles, one thing becomes very clear. We did some creative experiments, and you quickly find out that the battles, in an emotional sense, reach a point of diminishing returns very quickly. You just become benumbed by them all. The scale, the intensity, the sheer, horrific, repetitive pounding eventually makes you stop feeling it. And so rather than go from indecisive and horrific battle to the next indecisive and horrific battle, we thought we would focus on a few what we would consider to be almost signature battles, if you will, but they provide a very similar backdrop for the four individuals who have to live in that environment and allow us to sort of examine at a human level what's going on here as best we can, and to explore some of the questions that are very intriguing about this story, and not just about the human suffering, but about command decisions and some of the technology and some other things, hopefully interspersed with a little bit of comment about what's going on in the rest of the world while this is happening. And part of what makes 1916 so difficult is there's a lot of overlapping stuff. So if you tell it in a he said, then she said, then he said fashion, it becomes very confusing very quickly. The first thing to understand, though, is that 1916 comes about, obviously, because of plans made in late 1915. We'd said to you earlier that this was a real question for the generals about how you solve this Gordian knot that is the Western Front. So in late 1915, the Allied commands got together at a place called Chantilly in France to deal with this question. Their plan was going to be to continue to pound, and pound harder. But the new aspect was they were going to make sure that everybody, all the different Allied powers, pounded the Central Powers, Germany and France, at the same time. They were going to coordinate their efforts. This was going to nullify what the Germans had been doing so far. The Germans have a great army, but they can't be everywhere at once. Luckily for them, up until 1916, they weren't attacked everywhere at once. So they would use something called interior lines. It's a little like taking the center square in a game of tic-tac-toe. The Germans were able to use their wonderful railway system to transfer troops from less threatened sectors to more hot spots, and thereby frustrate Allied efforts. So the Allied plan for knocking down German fortifications in 1916 is that they're all going to attack at basically the same time, frustrating the Germans' ability to move troops to hot spots. The Germans had a different plan entirely. You see, the people at Shantou in 1915 who get together and decide to attack the Germans from multiple, locations at the same time, are still for the most part envisioning the classic military end to this war. They see the chances increased by attacking at multiple locations that you're going to crack the Germans somewhere. And when you crack them, you're going to send your forces through the breach, and you're going to send the cavalry through, and now the Germans are going to break, and they're going to be on the run, and they're going to be routed toward Berlin, and, that's how these things end in the minds of people who have a very, especially old-fashioned view of war. There are dissidents to this idea who say, even on the Allied side, you got it all wrong. It's not going to happen that way. The technology, the specific circumstances, the fact that there are no flanks on the Western Front, you're dreaming. And because you're dreaming, their plans aren't going to work right. On the German side, the people who have this attitude that old-fashioned viewpoint is just that, old-fashioned, happen to be in positions of higher authority than the dissident generals on the other side. They've looked at the way the war is going and figured out that the casualties are the difference maker. And that all these countries are suffering because of the numbers of people that are dying. You need to increase the numbers of people who are dying. Not only does it become hard to replace them, but it puts huge stresses and strains on the societies that are losing these people. Their families, their governments. Some of these societies are fragile enough to simply, fall apart like a house of cards. Others could have the entire population turn on the government and say, we've had enough. That becomes the best path to end the war in the minds of some of these generals. A guy like the leader in Germany, Erich von Falkenhayn, is looking at what these 1915 battles taught him. And they taught him that modern warfare on the Western Front turns into a meat grinder, no matter what you do. And he comes up with the brilliant idea. Again, most historians still think. Some people say it's shooting an arrow and painting a bullseye around it afterwards, but he comes up with the brilliant idea that these meat grinders are happening no matter what you design the battle to be like. What if you design the battle to be like a meat grinder? What if you create a meat grinder and then entice the enemy to come in? If that's what's so effective on the battlefield, what if you plan to grind meat instead of having it be a byproduct of other activities and plans? Falkenhayn in late 1915 determines that the French are already, near their breaking point in terms of the casualties they've suffered. And he goes to the rest of the military command and he starts talking about what he'd like to do in 1916 to try to win the war. He wants to set a trap for the French army. The idea is to create one of these, modern 20th century attrition amplifiers, one of these meat grinders, and then lure the French army into it. For that, you need bait. And the determination of where this awful battle is going to happen is dependent on what site can be chosen that would best play the role of bait. And I should point out that historians from different countries disagree on this. Americans and British historians often point out that this site chosen has no real military value at all, that it was solely chosen because it's the perfect emotional bait to lure the French army into the meat grinder. German and French historians, though, often assert that this site did have military importance and that did create a real military need to do what the French ended up doing. Nonetheless, the German plan is to use all this artillery first to pulverize the defenses around this important site that the French have an emotional and everything else attachment to. Blow the French off of these hills that overlook this city called Verdun, and then fortify the hills, bring your guns up there, start shooting at the city of Verdun, and wait for the French army to show up and try to knock you off those hills. And knowing the superiority of prepared defenses, the French are just going to bash themselves up against your barbed wire, your trenches, your machine guns, your cannon, and everything else in a place that was specifically designed to be a killing field. Thoroughly attritional, bloody 20th century way to conduct warfare, but it's not a bad idea. It also should be no surprise that a battle that was designed to act like a meat grinder turns into one of the most horrible battles of all time. Even the name, when I hear it, Verdun, it's like Stalingrad. It really is. It's one of those names that just conjures up a specific image and level of horror that puts it in a special place in military history. You know, it's sort of like if you said, you know, where's the worst place in the world to ever be in military history? It's like a tie between a million different spots, right? Mankind's had a long enough past so that there are recurring examples of horrific places to end up on any day. We like to cite the famous battle of Carlin thousands of years ago, where all those Romans were surrounded and trapped and killed over the whole long day. I mean, it's terrible, but probably about as bad as a lot of other terrible situations. There's a few where you just go, okay, that's as bad as the Battle of Cannes, but add artillery. I mean, Verdun is like nothing that has ever happened, really, on a large scale. I mean, I'm sure, again, mankind's a long history. Everything's kind of tried. Nothing's new under the sun, as they say. But Verdun is special. Verdun is so special, in fact, and so different and so outside the box for the thinking of the time period, that when Falkenhayn comes up with the idea that he's going to bleed France white, his words, it so runs against the grain of the 19th century sort of morality of warfare. Remember, we started this war a mere year and a half ago wearing white gloves with people who dueled when they were in school together and who thought of this in almost, especially on the Western Front, gallant kind of sense, right? We exchange swords when we surrender and all this stuff. And now we have generals thinking, okay, how can I lure millions of men into a confined space and just pound them into marmalade, to quote one French soldier's way of explaining what happened. One of the things I love, by the way, about this period, just like I love it about the Second World War, is that we have a lot of the actual words of the generals themselves. They all wrote memoirs, as we said, after the war, most of the time trying to defend their reputation against their critics, because after this war, everyone's pointing fingers at everyone. Because it was so terrible, people were so angry and so mad at generals, amongst other people that they were looking to blame, that all these generals would write pieces defending their ideas. We have Falkenhayn's, we have Ludendorff, we have all these guys' memoirs. Now, you can't take them, at face value. Remember, they're trying to stake out a historical position here in defense of their own historical reputation. Nonetheless, Falkenhayn, and you either love Falkenhayn or hate him. He has his fans and he has his detractors. I'm one of his fans. I like the way his mind works and the way he writes. And in his book, where he, written right after the war, where he's trying to explain his thinking on this, he runs down in logical fashion, where he sees the war in 1915. And it's not that bad for the Central Powers. You'll hear a lot of people that will say after the Germans failed with that initial knockout blow in 1914, it was all a hard slog downhill for them. Not necessarily. 1915 was a good year for the Central Powers. They'll have some other attempts where they'll almost win the war later in the war. So this is like, as we've said all along, a heavyweight fight. And there are times when both sides have the other side in trouble. A quick look at Falkenhayn's memoir shows that he thinks France is in trouble, that it's not that far from the breaking point. Here's what Falkenhayn writes about his thinking leading up to his planning for this battle that he's most known for at Verdun. Falkenhayn writes, quote, "As I've already insisted, the strain on France has almost reached the breaking point, though it is certainly borne with the